Now let's get an update on what's happening in Israel, especially when it comes to Australians. And I'm joined by Paul Rubenstein, who's the New South Wales chair of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. He joins me live from Sydney. Good to talk to you again, Paul. I've got to ask first about the group of Aussies in Israel.
Thank you, Chris.
At the moment, they're on a study tour that your organisation ran, like the one I did last month. The Australians, Paige Taylor, is in that group, and Nova Peris. We saw a video of her earlier. My understanding is that you might have been able to get them out of Israel into Jordan in the last little while. Can you bring us up to speed?
Well, yes, we've been trying to do that, and I've got to say that the Australian Embassy in Tel Aviv has actually been extremely helpful, as is the diplomatic staff in Jordan. Hopefully we'll have some good news. As I was walking in here, I heard that they were actually on their way, so hopefully that goes without incident, and we'll know in the next hour or two.
Yeah, good. We'll update people if we hear something throughout the hour. But I did get a message saying that they're at the border checkpoint heading into Jordan. So hopefully that's the case and they can fly out of there. Do you have any idea of how many other Australians are in Israel and are keen to get out?
Look, I don't know the exact numbers, but I have heard there's quite a few people. There are several groups. There were a lot of tourists there, many people are sort of stuck. Some people who are a bit more familiar with the situation are sort of happy to stay put, thinking that that is the safest option. But others, of course, have gone and trying to get to Jordan. I've even heard people trying to charter boats and get to Cyprus, etc. But I know that some people are more anxious than others, but there are quite a few people there in that situation.
The last toll I saw was that 5 Israelis have been killed. You, of course, were in Israel on that trip with me just a few weeks ago. You know exactly what it's like. The sirens go off. People go to car parks or any underground facility, some sort of bomb shelter. So Israelis, of course, are well drilled on this, but there's so many rockets coming in now. They're targeting civilian areas. People have been killed. What's your sense from friends and colleagues on the ground as to just how terrifying it is at the moment?
Well, I think, Israelis have been conditioned to this for a very long time, unfortunately. They've had to deal with rocket fire since the Scuds back in the 90s, so they're familiar with what has to happen. But this is another order of magnitude, Chris. I mean, as you alluded to in your introduction, what we have now is indiscriminate ballistic missiles. This is a different type of missile raining down on civilian populations, and of course, unfortunately, some of them are cracking through and hitting. I think it's still an incredible accomplishment that so many of them are, being thwarted. But this is really quite scary. So I think Israelis are quite stoic. They take it in their stride and they understand that I've been watching the Israeli media and there's increasing calls for people to be extremely careful and to take these things seriously. I think in the past people have really been a bit blasé about it, but now everybody is going to shelters, everybody's getting into their safe rooms. But unfortunately, there are some buildings before the 1990s which just don't have adequate protection. And that, if you look at the casualty figures, that is where most of the casualties and deaths are coming from people who haven't been able to make it into those places. So I'd say, stoicism, there's a lot of black humour, they really are quite remarkable in the way that they hold up. But it is pretty scary, and this is a different level of risk.
Talk to us about the action itself, how necessary it was, how expected it was. There are commentators and politicians in the West who try and suggest this has come out of the blue, but anybody involved in these issues for the last decade has always been focused on the Iranian nuclear threat. The diplomacy has obviously failed over a long period of time, and certainly over the past months, the intense focus of American and Israeli diplomacy has been on whether, when to strike, who to strike, how to strike. So it can hardly have been a surprise, certainly to anyone in Israel.
Well, absolutely. I don't think I think the timing is clearly a surprise to everybody. The Israelis clearly did take advantage of the situation and the talks and the Iranian complacency, thinking that they had cover with the dialogue with America. So they're clearly that aspect of it is surprising, but the fact that it's actually happening is not surprising to Israelis at all. This is a regime which is maniacal. It is an Islamicist, sort of crazy regime that means what it says, and it's been threatening to wipe out the Jewish people in Israel for decades. It's been its raison d'etre since it took power 40 years ago. And so, everyone has known that a time will come where this actually has to be dealt with, that words are not the way to solve this. I mean, you know, to take from Winston Churchill, there's a time for George Orr, but there's a time for war. And Israel reached that point. In the last couple of weeks, it came patently obvious that Iran was never ever going to relinquish its ambition to get a nuclear bomb. It would never give up enrichment. It spurned the IAEA that clearly censured it, and it doubled down and said that they were going to continue on this path. So the Israelis were not willing to risk another October 7 and not listen to what they were being told. So I think the interesting thing as well amongst Israelis is that across the political spectrum, there's support for what's happening. They understand that they're paying a terrible price. These are things that have never happened before in Israel, civilian centres being subjected to damage like this. But they understand that it's better to have 100 buildings destroyed and scores of casualties than to have a whole city burnt down to the ground with a nuclear weapon.
Talking about those political considerations...
It's not surprising.
Give me your thoughts on the Australian government's response. Now, on the one hand, you have Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese saying they understand the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, but they say, let's have talk and dialogue. Now, obviously, everyone would like this resolved the next instant, with Iran relinquishing its nuclear ambitions. But why don't we hear more from Albanese about demanding that? How can anybody go forward from here without Iran first relinquishing any nuclear weapons ambitions?
Well, look, Chris, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, the statements from our Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, I mean, they did recognise the threat to the international world order and to Israel. So that is a good thing, but I don't know why they didn't follow that up with a dose of reality. I mean, then to sort of talk about the path through to this being dialogue and diplomacy, unfortunately, is just not grounded in any form of reality. There's a complete disconnect with what's going on in the ground. And I'd say that, my reaction is one of really, I suppose, disappointment. And I'm disappointed in it because, I'd have expected Australia, which has had a great foreign policy and thoughtful policy for many, many years and has played a role, I would have expected them to clearly be able to support an ally in a position like this. I mean, Israel's in a position where I said it's fighting against not only the fact that Iran itself is trying to do this, but it is the epicentre of what's been going on since October the 7th. It stood behind the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Hamas, of course, 7 fronts. And of course, it's the absolute centre of all of the anti-Semitic lies that you see being propagated around the media in the world. So it's like the epicentre of all of this. And why we can't have statements that are fully supportive of Israel in that predicament, I mean, I find that pretty disappointing. And then the other thing that's disappointing, as you said, is the take on international law. I mean, unfortunately, our government has been pretty quick to sort of suggest or imply that Israel's not complying with international law, that it's in breach of humanitarian law, all sorts of things. And yet now we're witnessing war crimes, indiscriminate firing of ballistic missiles on population centres. I mean, you can't actually think of a more grievous breach of international law, and yet there's kind of silence.
Yeah, well said, Paul. Well said indeed. Paul Rubenstein there, who chairs the New South Wales branch of the AIJAC, the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council.